The air in the underground club smelled of expensive cigars, spilled gin, and cheap blood. Sadie just wanted to finish her double shift and pay her rent. But when the city's most brutal crime boss threw his undefeated champion at her feet and laughed, "If you can beat him, I'll marry you," he didn't expect the tired waitress to drop her serving tray. He didn't expect her to step into the ring. And he definitely didn't expect to lose his empire. The music in the foundry was a low, heavy bass that vibrated through the soles of Sadie's cheap work shoes. It was 2 a.m. on a Thursday, the kind of hour where the civilians were asleep and the predators came out to drink. Sadie balanced a tray of crystal glasses on her left palm, weaving through a crowd of men wearing suits that cost more than her car. She didn't look at their faces. Looking at faces in this place was a liability. She looked at collarbones, at the knots of silk ties at the holsters bulging beneath tailored jackets. She was invisible. Just a girl in a tight black uniform, her hair pulled back into a severe bun, wiping down mahogany tables and ignoring the casual cruelty that passed for conversation. "Bourbon. Leave the bottle," a voice growled to her left. Sadie didn't nod. She just set the bottle of Blanton's on the table, scooped up the empty glasses, and pivoted away. Her lower back throbbed. A dull, familiar ache. She ignored it just like she ignored the smell of copper and sweat drifting over from the center of the room. The foundry wasn't just a high-end lounge. It was an arena. Past the velvet booths and the VIP sections, the floor opened up into a sunken steel cage. Blood sport for the bored and wealthy. Every Thursday the syndicates brought their best fighters. No gloves, no rounds. You fought until the other guy stopped moving, and then the men in the suits traded stacks of $100 bills. Sadie hated Thursdays. The noise was worse, the men were drunker, and the blood took forever to mop off the concrete. A sudden hush fell over the room. The bass seemed to swallow itself. Sadie stopped by the bar, shifting her weight to her good leg. She didn't need to look up to know who had just walked in. The temperature in the room always dropped 5 degrees when Dominic stepped through the doors. Dominic wasn't a large man, but he occupied space like he owned the oxygen in it. He wore a dark charcoal suit, no tie, the top 2 buttons of his shirt undone. His eyes were the color of wet slate, moving over the room with a lazy, terrifying indifference. He didn't swagger. He just walked and the crowd parted like water. Flanking him were 2 men who looked like they chewed gravel for breakfast, but Dominic was the one who made the hair on Sadie's arms stand up. He was the head of the West Side families, a man who supposedly burned down a rival's casino while sitting across the street eating a slice of cherry pie. Sadie grabbed a rag and started wiping down the polished wood of the bar. Keep the head down. Keep the hands moving. Dominic slid into the grand leather booth at the front of the cage. A waitress, a new girl named Chloe, terrified, and shaking, scurried over with a glass of neat whiskey. Dominic didn't even look at her as he took the glass. His attention was on the cage. Inside the steel mesh, Dominic's champion was warming up. They called him Knox. He was a mountain of scarred muscle, heavily tattooed, with a flattened nose, and eyes devoid of anything resembling humanity. Knox had been tearing through the underground circuit for 6 months. He didn't just beat his opponents, he broke them permanently. Tonight his opponent was a wiry, fast-looking kid from the South Side docks. The bell rang. The crowd roared. Sadie kept her back to the cage. She focused on the sticky ring of condensation a glass had left on the bar. She didn't want to watch. She knew exactly what was going to happen. Pop, crack, thud. The sounds were sickeningly familiar. Flesh hitting bone. Bone hitting concrete. The crowd's cheer pitched higher, turning feral. Sadie closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, her breathing steadying into a rhythmic, measured count. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. "Hey, sweetheart." Sadie snapped her eyes open. A man was leaning over the bar, waving an empty glass at her. He was one of Dominic's mid-level earners. Leo. Cheap cologne, expensive watcher face flushed with gin and adrenaline. Refill. Leo slurred, slamming the glass down. And smile, why don't you? You look like you're at a funeral. Coming right up, Sadie said. Her voice was flat, devoid of tone. She turned to grab the gin. When she turned back, Leo's hand shot out. He grabbed her wrist. His grip was tight, his thumb digging into her pulse point. I told you to smile. Sadie froze. The noise of the club faded into a dull roar. She looked down at his hand on her wrist. A warning bell went off in her head. Don't. Let it go. You need this job. You need the money. But her body remembered things her mind tried to forget. Leo leaned closer, his breath hot and smelling of juniper. You deaf sweetheart. Sadie didn't blink. She relaxed her arm, letting it go completely limp. Leo, expecting resistance, shifted his weight to pull her closer. In that split second of his imbalance, Sadie's hand rotated. It wasn't a strike, it was a fluid, almost lazy-looking pivot. She twisted her wrist against his thumb, the weakest point of any grip. The hold broke instantly. Before Leo could process what happened, Sadie stepped back, picking up a towel and wiping her hand as if she had just touched something foul. Leo stumbled forward, hitting the lip of the bar. He blinked, looking at his empty hand, then at Sadie. His face flushed a deep, ugly red. You stupid bitch! He snarled. He reached inside his jacket. The sound of a gun clearing a holster is distinct. It's a dry, metallic snick that cuts through music and conversation. The men sitting near the bar scattered. Sadie didn't move. She just stared at Leo's chest, her weight shifting slightly, her feet planting themselves a shoulder-width apart. She was calculating the distance. 2 feet. She could bridge it before he raised the barrel. She would have to shatter his larynx to stop him quietly. Leo. The word wasn't shouted. It was spoken at a normal volume, but it carried across the room like a gunshot of its own. Leo froze. He looked toward the VIP booth. Dominic was leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. He was looking at Leo, and then slowly his slate-grey eyes shifted to Sadie. Put it away, Leo. Dominic said, You're embarrassing yourself. Getting disarmed by a waitress. She didn't. Leo stammered, shoving the gun back into his jacket, his face burning. She got lucky. Dominic ignored him. He was still watching Sadie. He didn't miss a thing. He had seen the way she broke the grip. He had seen the way she didn't flinch when the gun came out. Most importantly, he had seen her stance. He tilted his head. A slow, dangerous smirk touched the corner of his mouth. Inside the cage, the fight was over. Knox was standing over the kid from the docks, breathing heavily, his knuckles painted red. The kid wasn't moving. The crowd was cheering Dominic's name. Dominic stood up. He walked slowly toward the bar, his hands in his pockets. The crowd quieted down, parting for him once again. He stopped 3 feet from Sadie. Up close, he smelled of sandalwood and danger. What's your name? He asked. Sadie, she said. She kept her chin level. You didn't look scared, Sadie. Dominic glanced at Leo, then back to her. Most girls would scream. You looked like you were about to kill my lieutenant with a bar towel. I just poured him a drink, sir. Dominic chuckled. It was a dark, rich sound. He turned around, facing the crowd, but keeping Sadie in his peripheral vision. He looked at his champion in the cage, then pointed a finger at Knox. My boy here is bored, Dominic announced to the room. The acoustics of the club carried his voice perfectly. Nobody in this city can give him a sweat. He turned back to Sadie. The smirk widened into a cruel, mocking grin. It was the look of a man who played with people like they were chess pieces just to see how they'd break. You look tough, sweetheart. Dominic said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He gestured toward the bloody cage. Tell you what, you go 3 minutes with Knox. If you can beat my champion, He paused, letting the silence stretch for theatrical effect. "I'll marry you." The room erupted. Men slammed their hands on tables, howling with laughter. Leo doubled over, clutching his ribs. The women in the booths giggled behind their manicured hands. Inside the ring, Knox pounded his massive chest and let out a booming laugh that shook the chain-link fence. It was the ultimate insult. The untouchable king offering his throne to a peasant because the idea of her even surviving was mathematically impossible. It was a joke meant to humiliate her, to put her back in her place after showing up one of his men. Dominic looked at Sadie, waiting for her to blush, to cry, to apologize, and run out the back door. Sadie didn't laugh. She didn't cry. She looked at Dominic, really looked at him. Beneath the tailored suit and the arrogant smirk, she saw a man who thought he knew everything about violence, a man who bought his monsters and kept them on leashes. Sadie reached up and pulled the pins out of her hair. The heavy, dark mass fell over her shoulders. The laughter in the room began to taper off, dying in isolated pockets. She reached behind her back and untied the strings of her black apron. She folded it neatly and set it on the bar next to the bottle of Blanton's. Dominic's smile vanished. His brows drew together. "What are you doing?" Sadie stepped out from behind the bar. She didn't look at Dominic. She walked straight toward the steel cage, her cheap work shoes making soft, deliberate sounds on the concrete. "Opening a tab," Sadie said. The silence in the foundry was absolute. It was a thick, suffocating quiet, broken only by the hum of the neon signs and the heavy breathing of the giant inside the cage. Sadie stopped at the door of the enclosure. The referee, a bald man with a crooked nose, looked at Dominic in sheer panic. Dominic gave a barely perceptible nod. The referee unlatched the heavy steel door. Sadie stepped onto the canvas. It was sticky. She kicked off her cheap loafers, leaving them by the door. She stood barefoot on the blood-stained mat. Knox stared down at her. He was 6'5", 260 pounds of pure synthetic muscle. Sadie was 5'6". In her black slacks and plain button-down shirt, she looked like a stiff breeze would snap her in half. "Little bird." Knox rumbled his thick Russian accent, making the words sound like gravel in a blender. "Go home. I do not hit women." "That's good," Sadie said, rolling her shoulders. A sharp series of pops echoed from her joints. "Because you're not going to hit me." Outside the cage, Dominic stood perfectly still. His men were whispering, but he raised a hand silencing them. His eyes were locked on Sadie's feet. She wasn't standing like a civilian. Her weight was on the balls of her feet, perfectly balanced. Her chin was tucked down, protecting her neck. "Who the hell is this girl?" The referee backed away against the fence. Fight." Knox didn't want to do it. He stepped forward lazily, reaching out a massive, scarred hand to grab Sadie by the collar and toss her out of the ring. It was meant to be a dismissive, patronizing shove. He reached. Sadie vanished. She didn't step back. She dropped her elevation, instantly slipping entirely beneath his massive arm. In the same fluid motion, she drove her heel into the canvas, launching her body forward. Crack! The sound echoed through the club like a rifle shot. Sadie's palm struck the exact center of Knox's solar plexus. The giant gasped a wet, ragged sound as the air was violently forced from his lungs. Before Knox could even register the pain, Sadie pivoted. She grabbed his extended tree trunk arm. She used his own forward momentum against him, dropping to the mat and pulling him over her hip. It was a flawless textbook judo throw. 260 pounds of airborne muscle crashed onto the canvas. The entire cage rattled. The crowd gasped, a collective stunned intake of breath. Knox hit the ground hard, but he was a professional killer. Pain made him angry. He roared, planting his hands to push himself up his face, twisted into a mask of pure rage. but Sadie wasn't standing there waiting for him. The moment his back hit the mat, she scrambled like a spider, scaling his massive frame. She wrapped her legs around his thick neck, locking her ankles together in a perfect triangle choke. At the same time, she secured his right arm, extending it over her hip, hyperextending the elbow joint. Knox thrashed. He bucked his hips, trying to shake her off. It was like watching a bull try to dislodge a python. He lifted her off the mat, entirely slamming her back down. Sadie grunted, the impact rattling her teeth, but she didn't let go. She tightened the choke. "Tap!" She hissed, her voice cold and devoid of emotion. Knox's face turned red, then purple. He reached wildly with his free hand, trying to gouge her eyes, but she deflected it with a sharp, brutal strike to his bicep, deadening the nerve. She pushed her hips up, arching her back, applying catastrophic pressure to his trapped elbow while simultaneously cutting off the blood flow to his brain. "Tap or it breaks," Sadie said. Knox refused. He was Dominic's champion. He didn't lose. He let out a gurgling roar and tried to stand one last time. Sadie sighed. She dropped her hips and wrenched the arm. The sound of Knox's elbow snapping was loud, wet, and final. Knox let out a piercing scream, his body going rigid before his eyes rolled into the back of his head. The lack of oxygen and the shock of the break shut his nervous system down. His massive body went completely limp, pinning Sadie to the mat. 10 seconds. The entire fight had lasted 10 seconds. Sadie untangled herself from the unconscious giant. She stood up, breathing slightly heavier than normal. She smoothed down her wrinkled button-down shirt, feeling the sting of a mat burn on her shoulder. She walked over to the cage door, picked up her cheap loafers, and stepped out. The club was a tomb. Men stood with their mouths hanging open. Glasses were frozen halfway to their lips. The invincible Knox was a broken, snoring heap on the floor. Sadie walked slowly back to the bar. The crowd scrambled out of her way, terrified to even brush against her. She reached the bar, grabbed her folded black apron, and tied it back around her waist. Then she looked at Dominic. The mob boss was standing exactly where she had left him. The arrogant smirk was entirely gone. His face was unreadable, a mask of cold, hard shock. His slate-grey eyes were wide, staring at her, as if she had just stepped out of a spaceship. Sadie picked up her rag and wiped down the spot on the bar where Leo had spilled his drink. She looked up at Dominic, her expression bored, cynical, and completely unimpressed. "I prefer spring weddings," Sadie said, "but we need to talk about the catering." The bass from the speakers was still dead. The only sound left in the foundry was the wet, dragging noise of two bouncers pulling Knox's unconscious body out of the cage by his armpits. Dominic didn't look at his fallen champion. He didn't look at the crowd of syndicate bosses and capos who were suddenly whispering frantically to their respective crews. His eyes remained locked on Sadie. She was wiping the mahogany bar with methodical circular motions. He walked forward. The men in his path scrambled to get out of the way, practically climbing over booths to avoid being in his immediate blast radius. Dominic stopped at the bar, directly across from Sadie. He didn't speak. He just stared. Up close, the veneer of the untouchable crime boss was cracking just a fraction. A muscle in his jaw feathered. His hands resting flat on the bar top were tense. He was a man accustomed to absolute control, and this waitress in a cheap uniform had just driven a sledgehammer through his reality. Sadie stopped wiping the bar. She tossed the rag into a small sink, rinsed her hands, and dried them on a clean towel. She looked up. "Can I get you something?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but there was a raspy edge to it now. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the heavy, hollow ache of a massive dump of cortisol. "Who sent you?" Dominic asked. The words didn't come out as a shout. They were low, a deadly murmur meant only for her. "Nobody sent me," Sadie said. She reached for a bottle of sparkling water, cracked the cap, and took a long drink. I applied on Indeed. The manager Gary hired me 3 weeks ago, said I was good at multitasking. Dominic's eyes narrowed into dark slits. Don't play games with me. You just snapped the arm of a man who killed 2 Spetsnaz veterans in this very ring. You didn't learn that in a self-defense class at the YMCA. No, Sadie agreed, setting the water down. I didn't. Are you federal undercover? Dominic leaned in closer. The smell of sandalwood and violence was suffocating. Because if you are, I will have you chopped into pieces so small they won't even clog the drain when I wash you down it. Sadie didn't flinch. She leaned in too, mirroring his posture. If I were a Fed, Dominic, you'd already be in zip ties, she said quietly. If I were a hitman, you'd be bleeding out on this floor instead of your ape. I'm just a woman who wanted to finish her shift and pay her heating bill. You're the one who dragged me into your little circus to get a cheap laugh. Now you're embarrassed. Dominic stared at her. He searched her eyes, pale, brown, exhausted, utterly devoid of fear. He saw no deception, just a profound, bone-deep weariness. Behind Dominic, a tall, impeccably dressed man with silver hair approached cautiously. It was Gideon Dominic's underboss and chief strategist. Boss, Gideon said, his voice tight. The room. The Russians are agitated. They had heavily backed Knox tonight, and there is the matter of what you said. Dominic didn't break eye contact with Sadie. Clear the club, Gideon. Everyone goes home. Now. And the girl. Gideon asked, glancing at Sadie as if she were a live grenade sitting on a bar stool. The girl comes with us, Dominic said. Sadie sighed a long, exasperated sound. She untied her apron for the second time that night. Am I fired? Fired. Dominic let out a sharp, humorless bark of laughter. He reached across the bar, his hand wrapping around her upper arm. His grip was entirely different from Leo's. It wasn't meant to hurt, but to possess. It was the grip of a vault door closing. Sweetheart, you just became the most expensive liability in my organization. You aren't going anywhere. He pulled her out from behind the bar. Sadie didn't fight him. She knew when to conserve energy. She grabbed her cheap coat from the hook by the register and let Dominic march her toward the heavy steel doors at the back of the club. They stepped out into the freezing November air. The alleyway was lined with black SUVs. The engines were already running, puffing thick clouds of white exhaust into the night. Dominic opened the rear door of the lead vehicle and shoved her inside. He climbed in after her, slamming the door shut. The interior smelled of rich leather and gun oil. The glass separating them from the driver was thick and opaque. Dominic sat back against the leather, unbuttoning his suit jacket. He looked at Sadie, who was rubbing her shoulder where she had sustained the mat burn. In the dim light of the street lamps passing by, she looked younger, smaller, and incredibly fragile. It was an illusion, he knew, a terrifying, lethal illusion. Let's try this again, Dominic said, his voice losing some of its heat, replaced by a cold, calculating chill. I don't believe in ghosts, and I don't believe in waitresses who break bones in 10 seconds. So you are going to tell me exactly who you are, Sadie, or we aren't going to make it to my estate. Sadie leaned her head against the cool glass of the window. She watched the city lights blur together. She was tired. So deeply, profoundly tired of running. I used to work for people, Sadie said softly, not looking at him. People who make your little extortion rackets and illegal casinos look like a lemonade stand. When they decided I knew too much about their supply chains, I left. I changed my name. I moved here. I got a job pouring drinks for assholes who tip 15% because it's quiet. Dominic absorbed this. A cartel private militaries. It doesn't matter, Sadie said, turning her head to face him. They think I'm dead. I need them to keep thinking I'm dead. That's why I don't draw attention to myself. You just shattered the arm of an underground fighting champion in front of 300 people, Dominic pointed out dryly, and humiliated a syndicate boss. Not exactly a masterclass in staying off the radar. Sadie shot him a bitter glare. I told you, I was trying to stay quiet. Your idiot lieutenant pulled a gun on me because I wouldn't smile. My muscle memory kicked in. Then you decided to make a public spectacle out of me to inflate your own ego. She leaned forward, jabbing a finger at his chest. You put the spotlight on me, Dominic. You made the bet. You wrote a check with your mouth in front of every major player in this city. Dominic's eyes darkened. He grabbed her wrist, stopping her finger from hitting his chest a second time. Careful, he warned softly. Or what? Sadie countered, refusing to pull her hand back. You'll kill me, go ahead. Toss me in the river. Let's see what happens to the great Dominic's reputation when the whole city finds out he executed a waitress because she made him look like a fool and called his bluff on a marriage proposal. You'll be a laughingstock by sunrise. Dominic dropped her wrist. He stared out the front window of the SUV, his jaw locked tight. She was right. And that was what infuriated him the most. In his world, power was currency, but reputation was the mint that printed it. He had stood in front of the Russian bratva, the Italian families, and his own capos, and sworn on his pride that if she beat Knox, he would marry her. He had done it because it was a statistical impossibility. But she had done it. If he backed out now, if he killed her or paid her off, he would look weak. He would be the boss who broke his word because he was scared of a girl in a cheap uniform. The bratva who just lost millions betting on Knox would demand compensation. They would smell weakness. And in the underworld, when there is blood in the water, the sharks don't ask for apologies. They bite. You think you're smart? Dominic finally said, the quiet menace returning to his tone. I think I'm alive, Sadie replied, and I'd like to keep it that way. The SUV turned down a long, winding driveway, flanked by towering iron gates. Dominic's estate loomed in the distance, a sprawling mansion of stone and glass built on blood money and fear. All right, Sadie, Dominic said as the car rolled to a stop. He turned to her, his slate-grey eyes locking onto hers. You want to play the game? Fine, we play. But if you think snapping an arm is hard, wait until you see what it takes to survive in my house. The library in Dominic's estate was exactly what Sadie expected. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves, a massive marble fireplace, and the lingering scent of old paper and expensive scotch. It was a room designed to make visitors feel small. Sadie didn't feel small. She just felt a blister forming on her left heel. She kicked off her loafers, leaving them by the door, and walked barefoot across the plush Persian rug. She sank into a heavy leather armchair by the fire, pulling her knees to her chest. She looked entirely out of place in her wrinkled uniform, her dark hair a messy tangle around her face. Dominic walked to a crystal decanter on a side table and poured 2 glasses of amber liquid. He walked over and held one out to her. Sadie looked at the glass, then at him. She took it. Dominic sat in the chair opposite her. He didn't drink right away. He studied her. He was trying to find the seam, the flaw in her armor. Everyone had one. Let's talk about reality, Dominic said, resting his glass on his knee. The bratva lost a fortune tonight. Knox was their golden goose. You didn't just break his arm, you broke his shoulder capsule and tore 3 ligaments. He will never fight again. Sadie took a sip of the scotch. It was remarkably smooth. He should have tapped. They don't care about the rules of the mat, Dominic said coldly. They care about their money. Tomorrow morning they are going to demand a sit-down. They will demand your head on a platter as compensation. If you were just a waitress, I would hand you over wrapped in a bow and consider the matter settled. Sadie didn't blink. But. Dominic continued, his voice tight with irritation. I made a very loud, very stupid declaration in front of their parkan. I told the room that whoever beat Knox would become my wife. Ah, Sadie said, a dry smile touching the corners of her mouth. The old my ego wrote a check my reality can't cash routine. Shut up and listen to me. Dominic snapped, leaning forward. The mask was fully off now. There was genuine anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. In my line of work, a man is only as good as his word. If I break a public vow, I show weakness. If I show weakness, I invite a war. A war costs me men, money, and territory. So you're actually going to do it? Sadie said. She traced the rim of her glass with her index finger. You're going to marry the help. It's a business transaction, Dominic corrected sharply. A contract. You wear the ring. You stand by my side at public functions. You smile for the capos. It shows the Russians that you aren't just some random variable. You are mine, an extension of my authority. If they touch you, it's an act of war against the family. It neutralizes their claim for vengeance. Sadie stared into the fire. The flames danced in her pale brown eyes. A marriage to a mob boss. It was insane. It was a death sentence waiting to happen. But if she was Dominic's wife, she was untouchable. The people she was running from, the ghosts from her past, would never look for her at the apex of an organized crime syndicate. They would be looking for a quiet waitress in a dive bar, not a mafia queen dripping in diamonds on the front page of the society papers. It was the perfect cover, hiding in plain sight. What's in it for me? Sadie asked. Besides not being handed over to the Bratva. Dominic raised an eyebrow. Protection isn't enough. I can protect myself, Sadie said flatly. I prove that tonight. If I'm going to put a target on my back by carrying your last name, I want terms. Dominic let out a low, dangerous laugh. You're in no position to negotiate, sweetheart. I'm the only thing standing between you and an all-out war with the Russians. Sadie fired back. I'd say I have a seat at the table, so grab a pen. Dominic stared at her for a long, heavy moment. He slowly set his glass down. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten her. He just watched her with a newfound, begrudging respect. She was cornered, terrified, and exhausted, yet she was still baring her teeth. Name your terms, Dominic said softly. Sadie sat up straighter, wincing slightly as her bruised shoulder protested. 1, she started. Separate bedrooms. I'm not a prize you won at a carnival. We share a house, not a bed. This is a business arrangement, nothing more. Agreed, Dominic said without hesitation. I prefer women who don't sleep with one eye open anyway. Sadie ignored the jab. 2, I want access to a secure encrypted server. High bandwidth, untraceable. I need to keep tabs on certain elements from my past to make sure they stay where they belong. Dominic narrowed his eyes. I will not have you bringing a private war to my doorstep. If your old employers come looking for you, if I have the server, they won't. Sadie interrupted. I just need to watch the tripwires I left behind. You want me to play the dutiful wife, fine, but I need to know my blind spots are covered. Dominic considered this. He had the best tech guys in the city on his payroll. Giving her a secure line was a minor concession. Fine, but my men monitor the outgoing traffic. You don't send a signal without me knowing about it. Deal, Sadie said. And 3. She paused, looking down at her battered, cheap work slacks. She thought about the tiny freezing apartment she had been living in, the constant anxiety of counting pennies for groceries, the fear of every knock at the door. 3, Sadie repeated, looking back up at him. You pay off my debts, all of them. And I don't mean a weekly allowance. I mean a clean slate. I want to wake up tomorrow and not owe a single dime to anyone in this miserable world. Dominic leaned back in his chair. The firelight caught the sharp angles of his face. He picked up his scotch, took a slow sip, and swallowed. "Done?" Dominic said. The silence settled over the room again, but it felt different this time. The tension hadn't vanished, but the shape of it had changed. It was no longer the tension of a predator and prey. It was the tension of two dangerous people standing on opposite sides of a powder keg, neither one willing to drop the match. "We get married on Saturday," Dominic said, checking his watch. "Quiet ceremony. A judge I own. Monday we host a gala for the syndicates. You will be presented as my wife. You will smile. You will be polite. And you will not break anyone's arms." "Only if they don't pull a gun on me," Sadie muttered. Dominic stood up. He walked over to her chair. He was tall, his presence casting a heavy shadow over her. He reached down and tilted her chin up with his thumb and forefinger. His touch was cold. "Understand this, Sadie," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "You are entering a world of wolves. You showed them your teeth tonight, and they backed off. But they will test you. They will look for a weakness. If you falter, they will tear you apart. And I will not intervene." Sadie held his gaze. She didn't pull away from his hand. "I've been dealing with wolves my whole life, Dominic," she said softly. "They all bleed the same." Dominic held her stare for a fraction of a second longer, a strange flicker of emotion passing through his slate-grey eyes. Then he let go of her chin and stepped back. "Gideon will show you to your room," Dominic said, turning toward the door. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we go ring shopping." Friday morning tasted like burnt toast and expensive espresso. Sadie sat at the end of a 20-foot mahogany dining table, wearing clothes Gideon had procured for her, a pair of tailored grey slacks and a cream cashmere sweater that felt too soft against her skin. She missed her cheap uniform. It had been armor. This felt like a costume. Dominic sat at the opposite end reading a financial newspaper. He hadn't said a word to her since she walked into the room. The heavy oak doors opened. Gideon stepped through, followed by a small, nervous man clutching a black leather briefcase to his chest like a shield. The man was sweating profusely, despite the climate-controlled chill of the estate. "Mr. Klein is here, boss," Gideon announced. Dominic folded his newspaper neatly and set it aside. "Bring them over." Mr. Klein practically scurried to the table. He laid the briefcase flat, snapped the brass latches, and opened it. Inside were 6 black velvet trays, each holding an array of rings that caught the morning light and threw fractured rainbows across the walls. "Congratulations, Mr. Russo." The jeweler stammered, his eyes darting between Dominic and Sadie. "I brought the finest pieces from the vault. Flawless clarity, excellent cuts." Dominic gestured to Sadie with an open hand. "Pick one." Sadie stood up and walked down the length of the table. She looked down at the velvet trays. The diamonds were absurd. One was a pear cut the size of a quail egg. Another was a massive emerald cut surrounded by a halo of smaller stones. She stared at them. She didn't see romance. She saw a liability. "Try them on," Dominic instructed, watching her closely. Sadie picked up a cushion-cut diamond that easily weighed 5 carats. She slid it onto her left ring finger. It was heavy. "Well?" Dominic asked. Sadie held her hand up, examining the rock. She closed her hand into a tight fist. The massive setting dug painfully into the webbing between her fingers. She threw a slow, measured shadow punch at the air. Mr. Klein gasped, taking a panicked step backward. Sadie opened her hand, pulled the ring off, and tossed it back onto the velvet tray. It landed with a soft thud. "It catches," Sadie said flatly. "If I have to make a fist, the setting will tear the skin off my knuckles. If I reach for a jacket, the prongs will snag the fabric. It's useless." Mr. Klein looked as if he was about to faint. He looked at Dominic, waiting for the Mafia boss to erupt. "You didn't evaluate a $1 million engagement ring based on its aerodynamic properties in a fistfight." Dominic didn't yell. He leaned his elbows on the table, resting his chin on his steepled fingers. A slow, genuine smile crept onto his face. It was the first time Sadie had seen him smile without malice. "Show her the bottom tray, Klein," Dominic said quietly. The jeweler, hands shaking, pulled out the very last tray. It didn't hold towering diamonds. It held bands. Sadie's eyes settled on a thick, brushed platinum band. No prongs, no elevated setting. Just a heavy, solid ring of metal with a single square-cut diamond set perfectly flush into the platinum. She picked it up. It felt dense, solid. She slid it on. She closed her fist. The metal lay smooth against her skin, the flush diamond catching the light without protruding a single millimeter. "That one," Sadie said. Dominic nodded. "Done. Leave us Klein. Gideon will handle your payment." The jeweler packed up the rest of the trays with record speed and practically ran out of the room. Sadie kept her hand raised, looking at the dull gleam of the platinum. It felt like a handcuff. "Clara is waiting in the East Wing," Dominic said, picking his newspaper back up. "She needs to fit you for the gala on Monday. Try not to break her scissors." Sadie dropped her hand. She turned on her heel and walked out. The East Wing sitting room was bathed in natural light. Clara was a matronly woman, with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, a measuring tape draped around her neck like a scarf. She didn't ask questions. She just pointed to a folding screen. "Take off the sweater, dear. Let's get your measurements for the bodice." Sadie stepped behind the screen. She pulled the cashmere over her head and folded it neatly over a chair. She stood in her bra, the cool air raising goosebumps on her arms. She stepped out. Clara approached with the measuring tape. She wrapped it around Sadie's bust, then dropped it to measure her waist. As Clara moved to Sadie's back to measure her shoulder width, she stopped. The silence in the room suddenly felt incredibly loud. "Oh my," Clara whispered. Sadie didn't turn around. She knew what Clara was looking at. Stretching from her left shoulder blade, trailing down her ribs and disappearing into the waistband of her slacks, was a thick, jagged ridge of scar tissue. It was silver and angry, a violent map of torn flesh and emergency sutures. It was the kind of scar left by a high-caliber bullet that fragments on impact. "It's fine," Sadie said, her voice deadened. "Just measure." The door to the sitting room clicked open. "Clara, we need the dress ready by—" Dominic stopped in the doorway. Sadie didn't scramble to cover herself. She didn't flinch. She just stood there, her back to him, her posture perfectly straight. Let him look. He wanted a killer to play his wife. He needed to see the receipt. Dominic stared at the ruin of her back. The air left his lungs in a quiet, measured exhale. He had seen bullet wounds. He had caused plenty of them. He knew exactly what it took to survive tissue damage like that. He knew the agony of the recovery, the infection, the fever, the months of learning how to breathe without screaming. He didn't ask who shot her. He didn't ask when. He looked at the tense, defensive line of her shoulders. He saw the waitress who had snapped his champion's arm. He saw the woman who tested engagement rings for combat viability. And for the first time, he saw exactly how much she had paid to become that person. "Make sure the dress has a high back, Clara," Dominic said. His voice was soft, not pitying, just factual. He turned and closed the door behind him. Sadie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked down at the heavy platinum band on her left hand. The metal was finally starting to warm to her skin. It rained on Saturday. A cold, driving sheet of water that washed the grime off the city streets and turned the sky the color of bruised iron. Judge Harrison's chambers smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. The neon light fixture overhead hummed a low, irritating note. It was not a place for romance. It was a place for plea deals and civil suits. Sadie stood near the window, watching the rain streak the glass. She wasn't wearing a dress. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, perfect knot at the nape of her neck. She looked like a corporate assassin. Dominic stood across the room, talking in low, clipped tones to Gideon. He wore a black suit, his tie perfectly knotted. He looked completely at ease, a predator resting in the shade. Judge Harrison sat behind his massive oak desk, sweating into his collar. He kept dabbing his forehead with a crumpled handkerchief. Marrying a syndicate boss in a private, unrecorded ceremony was highly illegal, highly dangerous, and highly lucrative. "We are ready, boss," Gideon said, stepping back. Dominic walked to the center of the room. He didn't offer Sadie his arm. He just looked at her. Sadie stepped away from the window and took her place beside him. They didn't touch. They stood a foot apart, facing the sweating judge. "Right, yes," Judge Harrison stammered, opening a leather-bound book that looked entirely prop-like. "We are gathered here today to, unite Dominic Russo and Sadie. Just Sadie, in matrimony." The judge skipped the preamble. He skipped the speeches about love, honor, and cherish. He knew his audience. He moved straight to the mechanics of the law. "Do you, Dominic, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Dominic said. The words held no warmth, but they carried a heavy, terrifying finality. It sounded like a vault locking. "And do you, Sadie, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Sadie looked straight ahead at the wood paneling behind the judge. She thought about the empty bank accounts. She thought about the encrypted server currently humming in the basement of Dominic's estate. She thought about the invisible shield this man's blood-soaked name provided her. "I do," she said. Her voice didn't shake. "The rings," the judge squeaked. Gideon stepped forward, handing Dominic the thick platinum band. Dominic turned to Sadie. He reached out and took her left hand. His fingers were warm, calloused, and incredibly strong. For a second his thumb brushed against her knuckles. He slid the heavy band onto her ring finger. It clicked softly into place. Sadie reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a plain white gold band. She took Dominic's left hand and pushed the ring over his knuckle. "By the power vested in me by the state," Judge Harrison said, closing the book with a definitive snap, "I pronounce you husband and wife." He didn't say you may kiss the bride. He wasn't stupid. Dominic dropped her hand. "Gideon has your envelope, Harrison. Make sure the paperwork is filed with the county clerk by noon on Monday, backdated, not a word." "Of course, Mr. Russo. I mean, congratulations to you both." Dominic turned and walked out of the chambers. Sadie followed him, the sound of her low heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. They stepped out of the courthouse through a private rear exit. The cold air hit them immediately. A black SUV was waiting in the alley, the engine idling in the rain. Gideon opened the rear door and held a black umbrella over it. Dominic slid into the back seat. Sadie climbed in after him, moving strictly to the far side of the leather bench. Gideon shut the door, sealing them inside the quiet, soundproofed cabin. The SUV pulled away from the curb. They sat in silence for 10 blocks. The city blurred past the rain-slicked windows in streaks of grey and neon. Sadie stared at her left hand. The flush diamond caught the passing streetlights. Mrs. Russo. The name tasted like ash in her mouth. She was married to the devil simply because the devil's shadow was large enough to hide her from the monsters. Dominic reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a heavy matte black smartphone. He set it on the center console, sliding it across the leather until it bumped against Sadie's thigh. Sadie looked down at it. "Your server is live," Dominic said, staring straight ahead at the glass partition. "The connection is bounced through 3 offshore relays before it hits the house. Gideon set up the encryption protocols himself. You have administrative access." Sadie picked up the phone. It was heavy industrial, built for security, not aesthetics. "And my debts?" she asked quietly. Dominic finally turned to look at her. His slate-grey eyes were impossible to read. "You have no debts," he said. "The student loans the medical bills from the free clinic under your alias, the back rent on your apartment. Paid in full. Your landlord thinks you moved to Seattle." Sadie felt a strange, tight knot in her chest slowly begin to loosen. It was a knot she had carried for 3 years. The crushing, suffocating weight of poverty, of constantly looking over her shoulder, of counting pennies to buy generic ibuprofen for her back. Gone. Wiped out by a single command from the man sitting next to her. She looked at Dominic. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't expecting gratitude. It was a transaction. He bought a shield for his reputation. She bought a fortress for her survival. "Thank you," Sadie said. The words felt foreign. "Don't thank me," Dominic replied, his voice dropping into that familiar, dangerous register. "On Monday night, the entire underworld of this city is going to be in one room. The Bratva will be there looking for an excuse to bleed me. The Italians will be looking for weakness. You are the variable they can't account for." He leaned closer, the scent of sandalwood filling the small space between them. "You got your terms, Sadie," Dominic said softly. "Now you earn them." Sadie gripped the encrypted phone in her hand. The cold edge of the platinum ring pressed into her skin. "Just point me at the problem, Dominic," she said, her brown eyes hardening into something sharp and unforgiving. "And stay out of my way." The grand ballroom of the Hotel St. Regis was a masterpiece of gilded ceilings and crystal chandeliers. It smelled of roasted duck, expensive champagne, and the collective anxiety of 300 dangerous people in a single room. Sadie stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the private suite upstairs. Clara had outdone herself. The dress was midnight black silk, cut with severe geometric precision. It featured a high collar, long fitted sleeves, and a back that zipped up to the nape of her neck. It didn't look like a wedding gown, and it didn't look like a party dress. It looked like armor. She stared at her reflection. She barely recognized the woman looking back. The tired waitress with the cheap slacks and the throbbing lower back was gone. In her place stood a weapon draped in haute couture. The heavy mahogany door clicked open. Dominic stepped into the suite. He wore a bespoke tuxedo that fit him flawlessly. He looked completely at ease, adjusting his cufflinks as he walked in. He stopped a few feet behind her, his reflection joining hers in the mirror. He didn't say she looked beautiful. Beauty was irrelevant tonight. "The room is full," Dominic said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "The Italians took the east tables. The Irish are at the bar, and the Bratva just arrived." "How angry are they?" Sadie asked. She didn't turn around. She kept her eyes locked on his in the mirror. "Grigori is leading them. He is the Pacan's right hand. He lost 3 million on Knox's fight," Dominic said flatly. "He brought a dozen men. They aren't drinking. They are looking for a reason." Sadie turned to face him. She adjusted a diamond stud in her ear. "Then let's go give them one." Dominic extended his right arm. Sadie didn't hesitate. She looped her hand through it, resting her fingers lightly on the fabric of his jacket. The platinum band on her left hand caught the ambient light of the room. They walked out of the suite and took the private elevator down to the mezzanine. When the brass doors opened, they stepped out onto the sweeping marble staircase overlooking the ballroom. A string quartet was playing something classical and dull in the corner, but the music was immediately drowned out by the sudden, suffocating drop in conversation. 300 heads turned. Sadie felt the physical weight of their stares. It was an assault. They were looking for the waitress. They were looking for the joke. They were looking for a crack in Dominic's armor. Sadie didn't give them a single inch. She kept her chin perfectly level. Her face was an unreadable mask of absolute boredom. She didn't grip Dominic's arm. She rested her hand upon it as if he were an accessory to her outfit. She descended the stairs with a slow, predatory grace, her footfalls silent. Dominic matched her pace perfectly. He wasn't dragging her, he was presenting her. They reached the floor, and the crowd parted. It was the same way the crowd had parted at the Foundry, but this time the fear was entirely different. It was a calculating, quiet terror. "Smile," Dominic murmured, barely moving his lips as they walked past a table of nervous-looking capos. "I am smiling," Sadie replied softly, her face utterly expressionless. They made their way to the center of the room. Before a waiter could even offer them a tray of champagne, the crowd shifted. A large group of men in heavy suits detached themselves from the far wall and walked directly toward them. At their center was Grigory. He was a massive man with a shaved head, a scarred jawline, and eyes like chips of dirty ice. He stopped 3 feet from Dominic. His men fanned out slightly, a classic flanking maneuver. Dominic's hand slipped out of his pocket. He didn't reach for a weapon. He just let his arm hang loose, ready. "Dominic," Grigory said. His voice was a thick, rumbling bass. He didn't offer a hand. "Grigory," Dominic replied. His tone was perfectly pleasant. Grigory shifted his cold eyes to Sadie. He looked her up and down, openly assessing her. It was an insulting, aggressive stare. "And this is the bride. The little bird who broke my toy." Sadie didn't break eye contact. She let the silence stretch for a long, uncomfortable second. "Knox was defective," Sadie said. Her voice carried just enough to be heard over the nervous hum of the surrounding crowd. "He relied on momentum instead of leverage. You should ask for a refund from whoever trained him." Grigory's jaw clenched. The men behind him stiffened. "You have a sharp tongue, little bird," Grigory growled, stepping half a pace closer. The threat of physical violence radiated off him in waves. "In my country, women who speak out of turn lose their teeth." Dominic shifted his weight, his eyes darkening, but Sadie squeezed his arm slightly. "Wait." She let go of Dominic's arm. She took a single deliberate step forward, closing the distance between herself and the towering Russian. She was well within his striking range now. She looked up at him. She didn't raise her voice. She lowered it. "In my country, Grigory." Sadie whispered her tone, dropping to a pitch of pure distilled ice. "Men who threaten me end up finding their offshore accounts in Cyprus completely drained." Grigory froze. "I know about the shell company in Nicosia." Sadie continued, her voice a razor sliding over velvet. "I know about the 3 shipping containers sitting in the port of Odessa that don't technically exist on your boss's ledger. The ones you're skimming from. It took me 45 minutes on a secure server to find your fingerprints all over it." The color drained from Grigory's scarred face. His eyes widened slightly. "If you ever speak to me like that again," Sadie breathed, "I won't break your arm. I will send those routing numbers to the Parkon, and he will put a bullet in your head himself. Do we understand each other?" Grigory stared at the woman in the black silk dress. He realized with a sudden sickening jolt of clarity that the stories from the underground club were wrong. She wasn't just a physical threat. She was a ghost who could rip apart his life without ever throwing a punch. Grigory swallowed hard. He took a slow step backward. "We understand each other, Mrs. Russo," Grigory said. His voice was entirely stripped of its earlier arrogance. He gave a stiff, jerky nod to Dominic, turned on his heel and walked away. His men, confused but obedient, followed him back into the crowd. The tension in the center of the room evaporated. The string quartet suddenly sounded a little louder. Sadie stepped back, slipping her hand smoothly back through Dominic's arm. Dominic looked down at her. His slate-grey eyes were burning with a mixture of shock, amusement, and profound, undeniable respect. "Cyprus," Dominic whispered. "Your server is very fast," Sadie replied, grabbing a flute of champagne from a passing waiter. She took a sip. And Russian money launderers are very sloppy. Dominic let out a low, rich laugh. It was a real laugh echoing over the clinking glasses of the ballroom. He looked around the room. The Italians, the Irish, the cartels, they had all seen the interaction. They had seen Grigori, one of the most brutal enforcers in the city, back down from Dominic Russo's new wife. The message was sent. The fortress was sealed. The drive back to the estate was silent, but it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the courthouse. It was the quiet, ringing aftermath of a detonated bomb. They walked through the heavy oak doors of the mansion at 2 a.m. The staff was asleep. The house was a tomb of marble and shadows. Sadie kicked off her black stiletto heels in the foyer. She didn't care about the decorum anymore. Her feet were screaming and her spine felt like a compressed accordion. She picked up the shoes in her left hand and walked barefoot toward the library. Dominic followed her. He shrugged off his tuxedo jacket, tossing it over the back of a leather sofa, and walked straight to the bar cart. He poured 2 fingers of neat scotch into 2 heavy crystal glasses. Sadie collapsed into the leather armchair by the dead fireplace. She dropped her shoes onto the floor with a loud clatter and let her head fall back against the leather. Dominic walked over and handed her a glass. "To Cyprus," Dominic said, raising his own glass slightly. "To Leverage," Sadie corrected, clinking her glass against his. She took a long drink. The scotch burned its way down her throat, settling into a warm, heavy pool in her stomach. Dominic didn't sit in the opposite chair. He stood by the fireplace, leaning his shoulder against the marble mantel. He watched her. The adrenaline of the night was wearing off, and the cynical, exhausted waitress was beginning to bleed back through the armor of the black silk dress. "You bluffed him," Dominic said quietly. Sadie lowered her glass. "I didn't bluff him. I had the routing numbers downloaded onto a flash drive in my clutch. If he had pushed, I would have handed it to one of his lieutenants right there on the floor." Dominic shook his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "You are terrifying. I'm thorough," Sadie said, resting her glass on her knee. "I told you, Dominic, you bought a shield. I expect it to hold up its end of the bargain. I took care of the Bratva problem. Now you take care of mine. My server stays on. My ghosts stay dead. You don't ask questions about my past, and I won't ask questions about your body count." Dominic stared at her for a long time. The dim light of the single desk lamp cast long shadows across his face. He had spent his entire life building an empire on fear and intimidation. He had surrounded himself with men who followed orders because they were terrified of the consequences. But looking at Sadie, he realized he had finally found something he had never possessed in all his years at the top: an equal. She didn't fear him. She didn't need him. She had calculated the mathematics of survival and decided that standing next to him was the most logical equation. It wasn't love. It wasn't romance. It was something far more dangerous and infinitely more durable. It was absolute mutual necessity. "No questions?" Dominic agreed. His voice was a low, solemn vow. He walked over to her chair. He reached out his large hand, gently taking the empty crystal glass from her fingers. He set it on the side table. He didn't pull her into a desperate kiss. He didn't whisper empty promises of protection. They were past the point of pretending this was a fairy tale. This was a war council. Dominic looked down at the heavy platinum band on her left hand. "Tomorrow Gideon will bring you the ledgers for the South Side operation," Dominic said. "The capos there have been skimming. I need someone who can find the leaks, someone who understands accounting." He paused, his eyes meeting hers, and Leverage. Sadie looked up at him. She felt the dull ache in her back, the exhaustion in her bones, and the cold metal of the ring on her finger. But for the first time in 3 years, she didn't feel hunted. She didn't feel invisible. She felt lethal. Sadie let out a slow, cynical breath. A tiny, dangerous smirk finally broke through her exhausted expression. "Leave the ledgers on my desk by 8, Sadie said, leaning her head back against the chair. "And tell Gideon to bring decent coffee. The stuff in the kitchen is terrible." Dominic smirked back. It was a predator's smile. "Welcome to the family, Mrs. Russo. Did you enjoy this dark, grounded tale of survival and power? Sadie didn't just survive the Mafia's deadly game, she rewrote the rules. If you loved watching a cynical, brilliant underdog turn a crime boss's cruel joke into her own untouchable empire, hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who loves a fierce protagonist who uses brains and brawn to outsmart the villains. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next intense storytelling experience. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite power move from Sadie? See you next time.